There is a moment in war when a man discovers who he actually is, not who he thought he was, not who his training told him to be, not who his country needed him to become, but who he is at the bottom of everything, when the noise falls away and the choice is entirely his own. For Franz Stigler, that moment came on December 20th, 1943, at 20,000 feet above northern Germany, with his finger near the trigger and a broken American bomber filling his gun sight. He did not pull the trigger. What happened instead is one of the most remarkable stories to come out of the Second World War, a conflict that produced more than its share of atrocity and destruction and the grinding mechanical cruelty of industrialized killing. In the middle of all of that, two men on opposite sides of the worst war in human history looked at each other across the sky, and one of them chose mercy. It cost him nothing that day. It could have cost him everything. Franz Stigler was 27 years old in December of 1943, a Luftwaffe fighter pilot with 22 confirmed kills and one of the most decorated combat records in the German Air Force. He had been flying since before the war, had survived more engagements than most of his contemporaries, and had developed the controlled, calculating instincts of a man who had stayed alive in the sky by being better than the people trying to kill him. He was, by any measure, an exceptional pilot and a formidable enemy. He was also the student of a man named Gustav Rodel, a senior Luftwaffe commander who had told Stigler something early in his career that had lodged in him and never left. "If I ever see or hear of you shooting at a man in a parachute," Rodel had said, "I will shoot you down myself." The code of the aviator, the tradition, honored more in some quarters than others, that a defenseless enemy was not a legitimate target, had been given to Stigler directly, personally, by a man he respected. He had carried it with him through 4 years of war. On the morning of December 20th, he was sitting in his cockpit at an airfield in northern Germany, being refueled after a previous engagement, when he saw a B-17 Flying Fortress limping across the sky above him. He took off to intercept it. The B-17 was called Ye Old Pub, and it was piloted by a 21-year-old American named Charlie Brown, who was flying his first combat mission. The mission had gone catastrophically wrong. The bomber group had been attacked by German fighters over Bremen, and Ye Old Pub had taken damage so severe that by any reasonable assessment, it should not have still been in the air. The nose had been blown apart. 2 engines were out. The tail gunner was dead. Multiple crew members were wounded. The oxygen system was damaged. The hydraulics were failing. The plane was flying on the courage of its crew and the structural stubbornness of American manufacturing, and even those 2 things had their limits. Brown himself had briefly lost consciousness during the attack and had come to find his plane in a steep dive, pulling it out at the last possible moment. He did not fully understand how damaged his aircraft was. He understood that he needed to get home. When Stigler pulled up beside the bomber and got his first clear look at it, he understood immediately that something had shifted. This was not a fighting aircraft. This was a wreck. Through the shattered plexiglass of the nose, he could see the crew moving, wounded men trying to tend to other wounded men. A gunner slumped at his position. the entire interior of the aircraft visible through holes that should not have existed. The plane was not a threat, it was a disaster. And he could see Charlie Brown. The young American pilot, barely older than a boy, looked out his shattered cockpit window at the German fighter sitting off his wing and saw his own death. He had no functioning guns that could reach Stigler. He had no speed, no altitude, no options. He was, in the language of aerial combat, dead already. All that remained was for Stigler to make it official. Stigler looked at Brown and made a different calculation. What went through his mind in those seconds has been described in interviews he gave decades later, and it is not the calculation of a man running through military law or the rules of engagement. It was simpler than that and more human. He saw a crew that had fought and been destroyed. He saw men who were no longer combatants in any meaningful sense. They were survivors, barely, trying to get home. He thought of Rodel's words. He thought of the code he had been given. He thought, "I cannot do this." He did not shoot. Instead, he flew alongside the B-17, close enough that Brown could see his face, and he did something that made no sense in the context of a war. He helped. He flew formation with the damaged bomber, positioning himself to shield it from German anti-aircraft batteries on the ground that would otherwise have engaged it. When the guns on the coast swung toward the American plane, Stigler's presence, the German markings on his fighter, the implication that the bomber was somehow under escort, caused them to hold their fire. He did not plan this consciously. He simply stayed. At the edge of German territory over the North Sea, Stigler pulled up beside Brown one final time. The two men looked at each other across the few feet of winter air between their cockpits. Stigler tapped his brow in a salute. Brown, not entirely sure what had just happened, returned it. Then Stigler turned his plane and flew back toward Germany. He told no one what he had done. He could not. The Luftwaffe took a hard view of mercy toward enemies in the final years of the war, when Germany was losing and the pressure to fight without restraint was immense. What Stigler had done, allowing a damaged enemy aircraft to escape, actively shielding it from German defenses, could have been construed as treason. It could have been a death sentence. He filed his mission report without mentioning the encounter and said nothing to his fellow pilots. Brown landed Ye Olde Pub in England. He too said nothing for years, partly because he didn't think anyone would believe him, and partly because he was not entirely sure what he had experienced. A German fighter pilot had escorted his plane to safety. It did not fit any category he had been given for understanding the war he was fighting. The story might have ended there, buried under 40 years of silence. But in 1986, Brown attended a reunion of veterans and told the story for the first time to a room of former pilots. He described what had happened. He described Stigler. He said he had spent decades wondering who the man was. A friend suggested he write to a newsletter for former German fighter pilots, asking if anyone knew. He wrote the letter. Stigler, who had emigrated to Canada after the war, who had built a quiet life in Vancouver, who had not spoken of that December morning in 40 years, read it. He recognized immediately what it described. He wrote back.
Their first correspondence, exchanged across the Atlantic in 1990, was the beginning of a friendship that lasted the rest of their lives. They met in person. They embraced. They flew together at air shows. They spoke at schools and veterans organizations about what had happened between them in the sky over Germany, about what it meant, about what they had both carried for so long in silence. Brown said that Stigler had saved his life and the lives of his crew. Stigler said that Brown had given him something more difficult to name, the knowledge that what he had done had mattered, that the choice he had made alone in the sky had been seen and remembered and was worth making. They died within months of each other. Brown in November of 2008, Stigler in March of 2008. They had been friends for 18 years. War makes monsters of ordinary men, and the evidence for this is everywhere in the history of the 20th century. But it does something else too, something less often spoken of. It creates conditions in which the ordinary decency that people carry inside them is stripped of all its cover and stands alone, naked in the cold air, with nothing to protect it except itself. Most of the time, it does not survive. The pressure is too great, the fear too real, the tribal logic of us and them too powerful. But sometimes it does survive. Sometimes a man pulls up beside a broken aircraft and looks at the young pilot inside and thinks, "I cannot do this." And the moment he thinks it and does not do it, something that was going to be lost is preserved instead. Franz Stigler preserved it. Charlie Brown carried it home. And somewhere over the North Sea on a December morning in 1943, for a few minutes, the war paused, and two human beings looked at each other and recognized what they saw.